This video will show you how to do data entry for farm evaluations for 2016 surveys. First, you'll open your database and you'll see the switchboard. In order to enter farm evaluations, you'll click the button that says Enter Farm Evaluation Responses from the switchboard, and it will open your data entry screen. So the first thing you'll do is make sure that you find the member whose survey you want to enter. You'll do that by making sure your cursor is in the member ID section at the top left of the screen, and you'll select the binoculars. Then in the Find What field, you'll type in the ID number of the survey you're entering. For our example, we'll go ahead and enter ID 1016, and then you can either press Enter or click on Find Next, and it will take you to the screen for that member. You can close the Find and Replace window, and you can begin entering surveys. The first and most important thing is to make sure you check mark the Received box, and it'll automatically input a date of entry, which is going to be the current date. You'll then either check mark Complete or Follow-up Needed, depending on how complete the survey is. If the member answered every question on the survey, then you can select Complete. If when you went through the survey you noticed they were missing some things, you can select Follow-Up Needed. What I tend to do so that I make sure not to forget to click something is I usually select Complete right away. And then as I'm going through the survey, if I notice they are missing something, I'll uncheck that and change it to Follow-Up Needed. Next, if the survey was signed by the member or the lessee or reporter, whoever it was that signed it, you would select the Signed box so that it has a check mark and enter the name of the person who signed the survey. If it wasn't signed, don't select the check mark for signed, and you don't have to enter anything in Signed By. For date received, you would go ahead and enter whatever date you received the survey. And for signature date, again, if it was signed, you would go ahead and enter the date that the member signed it. If they signed it and didn't put a date, I tend to just put in the date received as the signature date. Otherwise, you would put in the actual date next to their signature. Next, you'll see the parcels that are from the previous year, or if they are linked in, it'll be, and it's a new survey, the parcels will be there. But you will want to check to make sure that everything is the same. If the member changed something, for example, maybe this member changed the crop from pasture to grapes, you can enter that in the crop field or make any other changes. If a parcel was added, you can add that on the next free line, and you would put in all the fields. First, you would put the management unit, then you would put the acreage. Let's say they added 15 acres of some more grapes. Field ID is not a required field. Some members use that field on the survey, some do not. You would just enter it in if they did enter something in. Then on APN, you would go ahead and enter in whatever the new APN is and the county that that parcel belongs to. If there's any specific comments you want to make for any of the parcels or fields here, you can make that in the APN site comment field, but again, it's not a required field. Management unit will always default to the number 1. If they only have one management unit, that's fine. If they have more than one management unit, you would want to change that 1 to whatever management unit. So say this member also has a management unit 2, you would change that 1 to a 2 and enter in whatever goes with that. Like we could say 22 acres of almonds, and maybe it's on the same parcel as the one above, or maybe not, whatever you would enter there. And county, and again, you could enter comments if you have any. Now, if this member completed a survey the year before, we could enter all the prior year results. Or if they didn't, you would enter question by question. So in our example, this member actually did complete one last year, but only for management unit 1. So what we could do is pre-populate their management unit 1 responses by clicking prior year results on the right-hand side. And every single thing that they answered for that management unit would show up there. Now, if they didn't make any changes at all to that management unit, you could just leave it as is. If they did make a change, you can go ahead and change it directly on the question. So let's say in this example, the member changed the nitrogen management method, which is question B4. You would reselect the question, and then in the response field, you would select whatever they changed their answer to. Let's say this member said they don't apply nitrogen on that field. You could change that. You could change as many as you need to. My recommendation, however, is if they made a lot of changes to their answers from the year before, to not pre-populate the answers. It can get a little confusing if you're having to go and change everything. But if only a handful of things or nothing at all changed, then I would definitely use the prior year button because it will save you a lot of time. So that's how that will show. And in our example on this member, we said they added a new management unit 2. So we would want to add that to the survey because it wasn't on there the year before. In order to add a management unit, you select the arrow that has a little yellow box next to it on the bottom part of the screen. And if you hover over it before clicking, it'll say new blank record. Select that. Very important, the first thing you'll do is enter the management unit number, which in our example is number 2. You have to do this before entering any questions or responses in order to tie any entries to that management unit. Once you've done that, you'll see this is completely blank. We can't pre-populate the prior results because they didn't have results for this management unit, but you can populate a few other things to make it easier on yourself. The first one would be the pesticide practices. That's question A1. A lot of people answer almost all, if not all, of those they use all the responses for that question. So to make it faster, we just made it so that you can just have them all there. To do that, you would select pesticide practices autofill, and you'll see that every single response for that question comes up. Say they didn't actually check mark target sensing sprayer used. So you would want to remove that since they didn't answer it. You do that by clicking on the gray box next to that line. It'll highlight the whole line and you press delete. And it'll ask you, are you sure you want to delete it? You can say yes, and then it'll be gone. So you can delete any that they didn't actually check mark, but it can save you time by entering them all there. Then you would want to make sure to go through and answer every other question on the survey. If they didn't answer a question, you still need to put the question in response here. So the second question of the survey, who do you have help develop your crop plan? That's A2. Say they said certified crop advisor, you could select that. The third question, does your farm have the potential to discharge? You would select that question. And whatever response they gave, either yes, no, or if they didn't answer it, you could put no selection. The next part of the survey is irrigation. So we would select irrigation practices, and we can say that they use flood on this field. Also, you would put in secondary irrigation. Now, that is not a required response, so it's not needed for follow-up. However, we do require that you enter it in there even if it wasn't answered. So secondary irrigation, click that. And you either select a secondary irrigation type if they have one, or no selection if there wasn't one. The next question is irrigation efficiency practices. Let's say that they wrote in something different. They selected other and they wrote something in. If their other response has something to do with the fact that they use drip irrigation, we've added a menu item, other drip, so that we can categorize those all together. You could select that. Or if their other was something completely different, nothing like what the responses given are, then you would select other. And in the comments field to the right of that, you would write in whatever they wrote. I don't have an example, but anything that they could have put in there, they could have said hand probe. Actually, that's more of a nitrogen response, but any comment they would have made if they selected other. Then you have the nitrogen management methods. It's the question before. And you can select any response. Everything possible is there, including do not apply nitrogen. In their survey, this is not something they could select, but they may have wrote in on the other response that they don't apply nitrogen. If that's the case, select that here. Do not put other and then type it in. We have that here so that we can lump those all together on reporting. The next question is regarding wells. First question, do you have any irrigation wells? Let's say in our example, this member said yes. Next question, are you aware of any known abandoned wells? We can say this person said no. And then we'll start entering the wellhead protection practices. And we're going to just do a couple here, and then I'll show you how you can autofill a few things for this. So first, let's say they did air gap. You would then want to enter a well ID. If they did not provide one, you can make up your own. I typically use like X1, X2, X3. You can use whatever you want. But if they did give a well ID, you definitely want to use what they did. And you'll notice this here, we have it so that the well type is pre-populated once you move on to the next section. So you can just tab over or even start answering the question. It defaults this year to irrigation. If for some reason they answered a question for a domestic well, if you type in a D, you'll see that domestic comes up, but primarily it'll be irrigation, and that'll auto-populate for you. So say they also said they have a cement pad. Again, you want to enter the well ID. And you'll see that the irrigation well type pre-populated. Now, let's say this member has 2 or more wells that they have all the same responses for wellhead protection practices. What you can do, instead of having to manually enter every single well, is add wells with same practices. You'll select that button, and a window will show up. It'll show the one that you already entered, X1, and you can add a well ID. Let's say they have X2, and let's say they have a total of 3, X3. Once you've entered all the well IDs that are the same responses as the first one you entered, you can select Apply Practices. And usually it takes a couple seconds, but it'll tell you the additions are complete. You can close the Add Well form and return to the main entry. The added wells can be seen at the bottom of entry. So I pressed OK. It says you can close the window, so you close it. And if you look through, you'll see all those are there. Once you've entered all your wellhead protection practices, you enter abandoned well practices. In our example, this member did not have any abandoned wells, so we would select NA, has no abandoned wells. You also will answer the well abandoned year question, even if they do not have any abandoned wells. How you'll do that is by selecting well abandoned year. And then if they did not have any wells, you can select NA, has no abandoned wells. I'll show you an example of how to also enter abandoned well practices in just a moment. The final part of the survey, part D, is sediment and erosion. So the first thing would be irrigation practices for managing sediment and erosion. You select that for the question. For the answer, you select whatever they put. If they put multiple answers, you can enter multiple answers here, whatever the survey says. And then the last question, cultural practices to manage sediment and erosion. Again, you would answer whatever they did. If they didn't answer that question, you would select no selection. If they wrote something, some random comment or something, you could select other and write that comment in, whatever they put. And that is good for this example. I'll go to another member and we'll show you how to do the abandoned wells if they have them. So again, you would put your cursor in the member ID section and hit the binoculars. Then in the Find What field, you would select whatever ID number you're looking up. Go to Find Next. Once that survey comes up, you can go ahead and close it. And again, you want to make sure you check mark received every time, either complete or follow up, who signed it, the date you received the survey, and the date the member signed it. Again, you can add or change any parcel information here, and you still have your buttons here. Now, in this example, we're just going to go over what you would enter for abandoned wells. Of course, you would enter your management unit, 1. And assuming you answered the rest of the questions already, you would then answer, are you aware of any abandoned wells? They said yes. And then you would do abandoned well practices, and you would select whatever response they did, either destroyed, certified by county, unknown method, licensed professional, or if they said they had an abandoned well, but then they didn't fill out the grid, you could select no data entered. We'll say this person said destroyed, certified by county. Just like with the irrigation wells, you would enter a well ID. If they didn't give you one, again, you can put your own. And the well type should auto-populate to irrigation. Then you would select the well abandoned year question. And if they did not provide a year, you would put no data entered. But if they did, you select C, well abandoned year. Again, you put in the well ID, the well type will auto-populate. And next to the well type, there's a year well abandoned field, and you can put that in. For our example, we'll say that it was abandoned in 2010. If you have any specific comments to make about that year, or the abandoned well year, you can put that in the field next to it. And we'll do another example of what to do if they didn't enter the data. So again, we'll say they did say that they have abandoned wells, but for their second well, maybe they didn't give you how it was destroyed. So you can select no data entered. You still want to select a well ID even if they didn't give the data. And again, it'll auto-populate. And then say they also didn't give a year for that, you would select no data entered, put in the well ID, and leave it there. And you can make any comments you feel are needed as well. Another thing to note on wells, you'll see more of this in the SOP that we provided you of how to kind of interpret things. But for example, if they gave a year range for abandoned wells, they said, oh, sometime in the 1980s. What we recommend is for your abandoned well, you just put the first year of whatever they said. So if they said it was in the 1980s, you would type in 1980. And then the comments, you could say something like, occurred sometime during the 1980s. So you can be specific there, but in the year well abandoned, we want strictly 4-digit years. The same thing if they gave a range like 1955 to 1957. We'll just put in 1955, and then in the comments, you can make that note. On the top right, you'll see some additional fields. You won't be using these until potentially after the report is done. If you end up entering more surveys or editing a survey after the report has already gone to the regional board, you would use those boxes, but it's not very applicable at this time. Once you have completed data entry for all the surveys you're working on that day, you can just go ahead and close the data entry window, which will be the second X at the top. And that'll take you back to the main switchboard if you need to use it for anything else. If you don't, you can just go ahead and close the database. Again, we do have an SOP for all data entry. It goes really into detail about what to do in certain situations. It has some data entry tips and things like that. So you'll definitely want to check that out. This is just basic data entry for surveys. Thank you for watching.